Today I would like to talk about something that Mr. Bradick had asked me to consider a while back. The subject is actually nothing new, but even though there is a tendency of humanity to lean in this direction, I think this subject may be important today for the Church of God and true believers than at any other time in history. You see, brethren, America is changing. And because of our vast influence throughout the world over the last century or more, when America changes, much of the world changes as well. And at one time, this country, the majority that is, believed in God and were widely led by fairness and moral decency that were found through biblical principles. And this belief led America to become the most prosperous nation that the world has ever seen. In recent decades, however, an illness has developed, and it is something far worse than COVID-19 and all of its different variants. It's more devastating than any plague that mankind has yet to experience. It is the emotional disease of apathy. While most epidemics result in physical weakness and sometimes death, apathy is a two-edged sword where the mind is affected first and the ill effects of the body might not manifest for decades. Now we can easily see how this illness of indifference has infected society when we consider the moral degradation of our culture that is leading to crime spiraling out of control, violence, hatred, a looming collapse of the economy. But what is most important for us to be aware of and to beware of is how apathy in our age is affecting those people who believe in God. And so to begin, or at least for the first scripture, let's go over to 1 Kings, the book of Kings, and chapter 4. Over the last couple of years, tens of millions have felt threatened by COVID-19. The government and most media outlets have been instrumental in instilling a deep sense of fear, leading to compliance to government control over our personal behaviors. There is a movement, actually, to eliminate many of the freedoms that were once the foundation of this country. Nearly all middle and lower class citizens today are being greatly affected by an economy that is getting weaker and inflation that is rising, threatening to become uncontrollable. Before all of this happened, however, that for decades, the do what thou will attitude was already leading to a steady decline of Western civilization. And what we are now seeing happening is many people letting go, whether intentionally or not, of those things that were once deeply cared about and cherished. Frankly, things that people have taken for granted much of their lives. And while many might continue to have various interests and hobbies or entertainment, things that may fall into the category of lust of the flesh or lust of the eyes, there is a growing apathy toward the principles that should trump everything else in life. The feelings about sexual deviance is a prevailing concern today, while the lives of unborn babies are considered meaningless, and the ideals of those people who have had traditional biblical values are degraded and presented to people today as being contrary to Americans' culture and America's values. But apathy is not unique to our age. You see, indifference towards moral decency has affected many nations in the past. It is a pattern that numerous empires and civilizations have experienced before they fell. And sadly, the enduring lesson of history is being disregarded and will therefore not save the generations now or generations to come. Why, with all of the advances that you and I have in technology and in medicine and in industry, people feel that we're much smarter and much more sophisticated than those civilizations of the past that have collapsed. And people think that we can accept and we can do deviance today with great success, unlike our ancient ancestors. But this is not going to be the case. Now, you and I might be watching all this play out on the world scene, and we might be shaking our heads in near disbelief because it seems like people are addicted to crazy and stupid pills. But the orchestrators of the apathetic epidemic are not insane. They are not stupid. Like COVID-19, the illness is by design, and it appears that it is quite intentional. So the powers that be know that what they're doing, but perhaps what they may not understand is the fact that they are instruments of evil. Now, what I would like for us to recognize, though, are some of the ways that apathy might be affecting us. You know, we might feel like, oh, we'll never be privy to any of that nonsense, of that indifference, of the moral decline of society and civilization, but it can affect us. In fact, it has already affected nearly every church in America, including the wider Church of God. So consider an example of a nation who was at its peak of prominence, both physically and spiritually. King David was instrumental in setting the stage for his son to reign. He had driven out much of the heathen in the land that God gave to Israel. He widely restored worship of the true God throughout the land. And his son Solomon was chosen to succeed David, to take the reins from here. And this man came into power, and he learned to sincerely have a deep love and passion for God and for his way of life and for God's people. Now, because King Solomon did not ask God for wealth or for power, but only asked for wisdom so that he could fairly and rightly govern the people of Israel, God blessed Solomon with wealth and power and wisdom. And some of this is recorded in 1 Kings and chapter 4 and verse 21. Verse 21, where Solomon rose in the morning. Let me see, that's chapter 3. Excuse me. Yes. Verse 21, so Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. And they brought tribute, other nations that is, brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. And now Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. So in other words, he had a large group of people, a large cabinet that were helping to serve the people of Israel, and this is all that they required for eating in one day, a single day. And they had plenty. They had all they needed. For Solomon had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tiphsah even to Gaza, namely over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on every side all around him, thanks to his father David and thanks to God. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan and as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. And Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And these governors, each man in his month, provided food for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table. There was no lack in their supply. They also brought barley and straw to the proper place for horses and steeds, each man according to his charge. And God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding and largeness of heart, like the sand on the seashore. In other words, he had a big heart. He wanted to truly and honestly serve people and do what's best for the people. not just for himself. And thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Hermon, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. His fame. So he was well known throughout the world. His fame and his prominence became known. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And also he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish. So his wisdom was just not in ethics. His wisdom was even in the creation. A biologist, if you will, microbiologist, scientist. And men of all nations from all the kings of the earth who heard his wisdom, or heard of his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. So nations from around the world, they would bring gifts, tribute to Solomon and to Israel, things that would be of enormous value, would be valued in the tens of billions of dollars likely today. Dignitaries traveled long distances in order to hear him speak and to learn how and why this society had become so prosperous. You know, we might think of people traveling to visit those of prominence in our age. Maybe some people traveled a long distance to visit Gandhi or Mother Teresa, but at one time, the nations had high regard for a person that was truly led by God. If you go over to Proverbs in chapter 1, it says that Solomon wrote 1,000 songs and thousands of proverbs, and God gave this wisdom, this understanding to Solomon. It's the wisdom that he had also given to Solomon's faithful forefathers, an everlasting wisdom, wisdom that will endure the ages. And Solomon sought to share that wisdom with others. He encouraged people to seek it out, and in doing so, he led people to revere the eternal, the God of Israel. In Proverbs chapter 1, in verse 1, it begins by saying the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion, that is good advice and discerning to others. A wise man will hear this and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel, to understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles. And then he closes this introduction here by saying, the fear of the eternal is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And in other words, foolish people will despise this and be like, well, I'm not going to go in that direction. But this is a key to understanding and to wisdom. And so Solomon continued by declaring that wisdom is not shared by the wicked. Oh, craftiness might be clever, but it is not wise. And if we just look around us and we consider the behaviors of many people today in regards to a disregard for morals, in regards to mistreating the creation, reverence for God first and foremost in our mind is a key. And we can hear this wisdom. It is actually being put on display every single day of our lives if we just look around and we're focused, where we pay attention. And Solomon wrote this in verse 20 of Proverbs 1. He said, wisdom calls aloud outside. She raises her voice in the open squares. She cries out in the chief concourses. At the openings of the gates in the city, she speaks her words. So wisdom is always there. It's always crying out. It's always trying to reach out to us. It's there when we just look at creation. It's there when we look at the foundations of structures in God-fearing societies. An honest and sincere analyzation of life will lead to lesson after lesson of wisdom if we are looking at it with the reverence of God in mind. Even if we go outside in the streets and we might see a couple homosexuals holding hands, or there's an LGBTQYZ parade going on, we can gain wisdom in understanding that that is evil, that that is harmful, and it has to be avoided. Now, what Solomon later discovered is that knowledge is of little value, and he documented it here in the first proverb, when it's not used ethically. That's why he said the reverence for the eternal is the beginning of knowledge. So doctorates, PhDs, college degrees, these do not make a person wise. Information does not make a person wise unless it's applied ethically. So to become a wise person requires first to have reverence for God, to have reverence for his laws. If we turn over to Ecclesiastes in chapter 1, with enormous wisdom, Solomon led the people of Israel. He gave wise, practical, moral instruction, and he published it throughout the land. The Proverbs are filled with this passion for wisdom, this humility for justice and honesty, and also documenting the downfalls of pride and dishonesty and stealing and murder and every sin, basically. Solomon spent 2 decades building his palace and the temple. And sadly, after a few decades had passed, Solomon began to take his wisdom for granted. He became accustomed to the wealth and to the amazing understanding that he had. Eventually, Solomon became apathetic toward those things that had given him such prominence and prestige. A sense of indifference had developed in this once wise man, indifference for the things of God. And Solomon began to consider deviant behaviors in order to perhaps satisfy his boredom, or perhaps to supposedly increase the knowledge of his database. And so it is that over a number of years, or so it was, Solomon dabbled in all kinds of wicked behavior. The greatness of Israel began to wane. And still, this once wise king did not return to God. It was only near the end of his life that Solomon looked back and he realized what had happened. He realized that life was fleeting and that there would be no purpose and no hope if life was not lived with the great hope of God and his kingdom in mind. And so he wrote another book. It is called the Book of Ecclesiastes. And he said this in Ecclesiastes 1, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. So he's talking about vanity in the highest degree. I mean, in other words, he's referring to, and we will, if you read the whole book, and especially particularly to the end, at the end we see that it's all vanity if it's not done with God in mind, with his ethics in mind. What profit, he continues to say in verse 3, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. Not technically forever, but it just keeps on going. You know, your life is just but a vapor compared to the age of the earth. The sun also rises, and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes toward the south, it turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually, much like it is today outside, and it comes again on its circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, and yet the sea is not full. It doesn't fill up. It just continues to keep playing out. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot express it, meaning we can't do it all. And yet we try. Why do we try? Why? Because he says, the eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. So if you just try to fill your life with the things of this world and to do and experience everything you can in this world, you're never going to be satisfied. You'll realize at the end it's all vanity. It really was not worth the effort. That which has been, verse 9, is what will be. That which is done and what will be done, and there's nothing new under the sun. Oh, you may have come up with a different invention, perhaps had some kind of something that was never existed before, but it's all vanity. It all ends up the same unless we have a great hope in mind. Is there anything of which it may be said, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. And yet there's no remembrance of the former things. People are not going back and looking at history and going, well, how did this play out for them? Let's not make the same mistake. They're going, oh no, we can do it different this time. It'll be different for us. Our outcome will be different. There's no remembrance of the former things, nor will there be any remembrance of the things that are to come by those who will come after. And I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. And I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task God has given to the sons of men, by which they may be exercised. And I have seen all the works that are done under the sun. And indeed, all is vanity and grasping for the wind. Try to grab the wind. You're not going to get it. You just keep trying. It's not going to happen. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. I commuted with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness, and I have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. And my heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. And I set my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. And I perceived that this also is grasping for the wind. And so he admits it here. He sought wisdom through those things that are madness and folly, that's foolishness, foolish behavior. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. And so you could think that he came to an understanding that this isn't talking about the wisdom and the knowledge of God, but at this point Solomon is indicating he became very depressed. Very depressed, and was seeing everything as being vanity. And at the conclusion of the book, we'll hear him say, well, we're not going to read it today, but you'll hear him say at the conclusion of the book and of his life, what is the duty of man? He asks the question, what is this duty of man? What does God expect of us? Revere God, keep his commandments. This is our duty, our responsibility. And if we keep that first and foremost in our mind, it will be well with us in the end. But Solomon, 1 Kings 11, if you go to 1 Kings 11, Solomon had forgotten what made him and Israel great, and it led him to deep depression. Everything that he experienced seemed to no longer have any value. Instead of focusing on what was best for himself morally and best for the nation morally, he became focused on what he could experience, what he could do in life, all of the feelings, the emotions, the pleasures. He sought pleasures in ways that were immoral. He made treaties with the Gentile kings, trying to ensure safety or security for himself and for his people, and he realized this is not going to work. This is of no value. In 1 Kings 11, verse 1, it speaks about some of this, where it says, King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Eternal has said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. And Solomon clung to these in love. And what did it do? Just as God said, it turned his heart away from the true God. Solomon had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the eternal his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, the same goddess that we get the term and the holiday Easter from today. The goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom in the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Eternal, and did not fully follow the Eternal, as did his father, David. So Solomon stopped following the knowledge, that is, the wisdom that God had given him. And God said later that the kingdom was going to be taken away from Solomon, that it would be given to someone who would not do well with it. And something similar has happened and is happening in America. And the reason is because this lesson is no longer understood by the leaders of this country. Leaders of this nation no longer read the Bible as they did in times past. And they think, oh no, it's going to be different for us today. We'll do it different. We're sophisticated. We have technology. We can do it right this time. And it's going to end up horribly wrong. But my focus today is not for them. My focus is for those of us who believe, because the lesson is not just for leaders of today. The lesson from Solomon is for those who are called to become leaders in the world to come. And so let's go over to Revelation 3, Revelation chapter 3. Sociologists have created categories of generations throughout, I guess more recent history. And when it comes to the categories of generations that are still alive today, there is 6. There is what is called the silent generation, which refers to individuals that were born between the years 1925 and 1945. There are baby boomers, which are people that were born between 1946 and 1964. There is the Generation X, that includes those born between 1965 and 1979. There's a category called the Zennials, beginning with an X, which includes those born between 1975 and 1985. There is the Millennials, people born between 1986 and 1994. And then there's Generation Z, for those born between 1995 and 2012. And there's also the up-and-coming Alpha generation, they call it. They're going to start over. Supposedly that's part of this great reset that's going on. It's going to be great. Nope. But in any case, they call them the Alpha generation, those born between 2013 and 2025. Well, these titles refer not only to birth years, but they actually come with certain characteristics that are dominant for each generation. Within each of them, there have been occasional national trials that has affected many of the people, that has affected the culture and circumstances, perhaps attitudes and characteristics, particularly, of course, during times of war. We understand, America and much of the world was greatly affected because of World War II. We were affected culturally because of the Vietnam War and other national tragedies. Even 9/11 falls into the terrorist attacks of 9/11 falls into that category. Still, the majority of all of these generations that I had mentioned have enjoyed decades of peace and prosperity. Oh, it hasn't been all fun and games, and there has been hard times, but vastly decades of peace and prosperity. And the reason for this and for the prominence of America, it comes from the fact that we were once considered a Judeo-Christian nation. And this means that the laws and the government of this country were built on biblical principles. No other nation in modern times could say such a thing, that has had such principles. And that is why the American experiment was such a huge success. Now, it wasn't without flaw. We did not do everything right. We made mistakes, and sometimes we did things that were just flat out wrong. We had our share of difficulties and trials, but the widespread reverence for God led to achievements of America that otherwise would be impossible. Now, we were once known as a Christian nation, but as Obama and his socialist comrades began to say, not any longer. And you say a lie long enough and people start to believe it, and people lean in that direction. And so the freedoms that most people have enjoyed for most of their lives had been taken for granted. And people feel free that, well, I have a license to sin. I can do whatever I want now. Over the last 50 or more years, people have become dissatisfied, if you will, with traditional biblical joys. And of course, I'm talking about biblical values. People began to desire something different, something deviant. So they attempted to redefine what's right and what's wrong. They started redefining good and bad, and now people even confuse the difference between a man and a woman. Or at least they refuse to note that there is a difference. People intentionally disregard, distort, or misrepresent the truth, and they call the truth misinformation. Something similar, though, has happened in the Church of God. Many have been called, and many have been given an understanding that leads to the kind of wisdom that Solomon once encouraged people to gain. And our calling led to a deep understanding of the Scriptures and how we should rightly apply biblical principles in a way that even most believers have failed to recognize for centuries. And we came to realize, that we have an opportunity here. We have an opportunity to become sons of God. Can you imagine? Literally being born again eventually into the God family. And that carries with it a great hope of God's kingdom coming to this earth and what the world will be like when Christ returns. Sadly, many have taken God's truth for granted, and the passion that most had in the Church of God began to wane in the late 1970s and then into the 1980s. Many became lukewarm toward the things of God. And today, there are people in the church that may have been around for a long time. They've been in the church for years. Maybe we have heard hundreds of sermons. And perhaps we begin to think that, well, there's nothing really more to know. That we've learned it all, we've heard it all, we understand everything, and well, there's really not any more growth necessary. And like Solomon, many of these people developed a sense of boredom, apathy. And so people began to seek information elsewhere. Some people went to Judaism, searching the Talmud for more information. Some people might have turned to messianics, to traditions of the Jews, or maybe even turning to beliefs of Protestants. It's the kind of apathy that Solomon developed, who began looking for something else, something outside of God's wisdom. And so we see that there have been many people in the Church of God today that have developed pet doctrines that have become their cross to bear, their standard of faith. Many began to gather interest outside of the church, and at the same time, a zeal for the things of God began to fade. And that is what Solomon experienced. And it is similar to what America has gone through and is going through. And the Church of God now finds itself greatly affected by the apathy of our age. Now, God knew that this was going to happen. God understood the tendency of human nature from the very beginning. He knows this. And given the right conditions, God understood about how long it was going to take for his church to be affected by this apathetic environment. And so it is that Christ, through an angel, dictated 7 letters. And these letters would reflect the attitude and the conditions that people in the true church of God would face when their era arrived. And if you do not understand this subject, excuse me, I knocked over my water. It's okay. If you don't understand this subject, I highly, strongly recommend that you request and you read this book, Evidence for Eras. This book presents both biblical and extra-biblical information, evidence, that is, proving that the Church of God does have eras that have existed down through the ages. And also it explains why it is important for us to understand these eras, particularly the reasons why Christ wrote of the conditions and the dominant behavior and attitudes of the Church of God in our era, the last one. So after a thorough study of this subject, it took Mr. Bradick and I years to complete. The importance of understanding every aspect of the letter written to our era was magnified, and it is magnified in the book. Now, I'm not going to discuss every facet of our era today, but I am going to consider the most important one and highlight a few. Really, when you look at the subject, you should go back and consider the era just before ours, the Philadelphian era, the 6th era of the Church of God. The Philadelphian era resulted in great passion for the things of God. It resulted in many truths being restored to the church, and it resulted in righteousness widespread throughout the church. And then following that, prosperity. Prosperity of which the Church of God has never really experienced until the Philadelphian era existed. This began in the mid-1930s, and by the late 1950s, the Church of God was broadcasting its World Tomorrow program 7 nights a week all over the world, and it was using more radio wattage than any other radio program on the planet. The subscription list for the Plain Truth magazine grew to an astounding 7.5 million issues being printed in 7 languages every month. Those are huge numbers. 3 colleges were established, and these colleges were in Texas, one in California, and one in England. And these colleges were training thousands of teenagers and young adults to become successful, God-fearing pillars in their communities. The Pastor General, Herbert Armstrong, this man eventually was able to begin meeting with presidents, with kings, with dignitaries around the world, talking to them about the way to peace and prosperity through obedience to God's law. So the prominence of the Church of God at that time was huge. Never before had the church had such prominence. But people began to take this for granted. Zeal for the ways of God began to fade after Mr. Armstrong's death. It really began, I think, probably in the late 70s, but Mr. Armstrong nearly died, but he came back from death's door, and he came back stronger, you could say, than ever, and he put the church back on track. But after his death, the next era began to take hold. Notice what Christ said of our time in Revelation chapter 3, the Laodicean age. In verse 14, he says, "To the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, These things says the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I could wish that you were cold or hot. Tepid, lukewarm," he's talking about, apathetic. So then, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. And because you say that I am rich, I have become wealthy, I have so much understanding and knowledge, and have need of nothing, we know it all. I've heard hundreds of sermons, right? We know everything. There's nothing really new to understand anymore. No more growth necessary. But you do not understand or know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. Now, these descriptions are all symbolic of you're not rich with not the knowledge that you need. There are things that you need, and you're blind to it. You don't understand. And he later says, anoint your eyes with eye salve. You need medicine so that you can see, you can understand the kind of medicine that only God can give. And you don't have the righteous garments that you think you're wearing. In his eyes, we're naked. Now, there's a combination of reasons why the majority of the church today is lukewarm, neither cold or hot. You could call it lacking in enthusiasm, indifferent, or half-hearted. One of the reasons is there are many people who actually went along with the liberal changes that were taking place after Mr. Armstrong's death in the 1980s and then into the 90s. In addition to this, there are a great number of ministers in the Church of God who should have tried to protect the people from the heresy that was coming in, but instead they tried to protect themselves, tried to keep their job, keep their income coming in. There were people who left because of the apostasy. And they formed a variety of Church of God organizations. And throughout those organizations, some were more conservative, some were perhaps more liberal, but both were affected by the tepid atmosphere of this era. Many brethren began to take sides, of course, believing that, well, we're the Philadelphians, and those people in the other groups, they are the Laodiceans. However, there was only a fraction in both groups, only a fraction of the zeal that was held previously by the majority of people for decades. As a result, there has been for some time now, I think in the most part, I'm speaking on a broad scale here, but for most people, a minimal effort to develop the character of Christ. And then, at times when legitimate correction did come to the church, few people seemed willing to accept it. Thinking, oh, well, that wasn't something that Mr. Armstrong taught, so that there must not be any truth to it. Well, instead of looking at the Bible, what does the Bible say? Not what exist in some tradition or something that perhaps previously was not fully understood. People began to discount something that was truth and called it misinformation or misrepresentation, personal opinions, or perhaps unique circumstances began to be the method for judging spiritual matters, instead of allowing the Bible to be the judge, to determine right from wrong. The name of this era gives us insight into what we have been experiencing for more than 20 years. Laodicea comes from a combination of Greek terms. One is the word laos, which means people, and the second term is decay. That's how it's pronounced, decay, which means judgment, punish, or vengeance. So if you put the two definitions together, we find that we live in an age that could be said it's the people who judge. Or you could also say people that are deserving of judgment. And both, I think, are applicable. Now, when we look at what has happened in the Church of God, we can see that there is a comparison to what has happened in the nation of America, because the wisdom that came from adherence to moral decency, the biblical principles, led to decades of prosperity. And this was eventually taken for granted. And now we see that there's an epidemic of apathy in our country and around the world. People are deciding for themselves what are right and wrong. And because of the evil that people are choosing, because of their dissatisfaction with biblical principles and a biblical way of life, we see that we are becoming a nation that will be fit for God's judgment. So it is also with the church of God. The wisdom many have been given, and the wisdom that is still available to us. It's not like it's secret. It's there. It's in the streets. It cries out. It's when you open the door of your house. It's there. Just look for it. Just look around. It's there. That's how we live. Wisdom can be found if we choose if we make our choices through the ethics of God, as that is a filter, something we should filter our entire life. Everything we do should be filtered through God's commandments. So Christ addressed this era with a title that fits its prevailing attitude. People have taken things for granted. Many have compromised. Many people have let down. Church members are judging others or judging for themselves what doctrines should be kept and which ones they are going to disregard. And for this reason, Christ continued to say in the letter that many are going to have to purchase gold, which is a symbol for character, for quality. They're going to have to purchase this, being refined by fire, which is symbolic of intense trials. In verse 18, it says, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich. Oh, you think you're rich and increased with goods, but you're not. And that you may attain white garments, that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed. And anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see. And so this was an ointment to be put on the eyes to help with blindness. Like the society that you and I live in, many do not feel a need to have much more understanding. People don't really want it. They don't want to be corrected for the most part today. Perhaps that's why the Eternal Church of God has remained such a small group. We widely give corrective sermons. And for the most part, the Church of God as a whole, they don't want corrective sermons. People want to hear that we're the good guys. Yay for us, yay team. We have the Sabbath, we have the holy days. They don't want to hear that, you know what? Everything's not all good. We need to repent. We need to be zealous, as Christ indicates in his letter. And this is much like the society that we live in. They don't want correction. There's a mixture of truth and falsehood out there today. And like a loving parent who truly wants what's best for their child, who truly cares about the future of their children, Christ says this in Revelation 3 and verse 19, as many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Therefore be zealous and repent. He's not just telling us what's wrong. He's telling us here's how to fix it. Here's how to get right. Proverbs 1, back to the book of Proverbs. Christ admonishes the end-time church to become passionate about the things of God, to regain the first love, to change our attitude and our behavior. And his warning speaks of severe circumstances in order to bring about repentance. In other words, if we don't repent and change, we're going to face some very difficult times. And Paul said something similar in 1 Corinthians 10:12 when he said, therefore to him who thinks he stands, take heed lest you fall. If you think you're okay, be careful, beware. You might be in for a fall. And the admonishment that Christ gave and that Paul spoke of actually came to us long before John wrote documented the letters that Christ dictated to church eras. They actually came back when Solomon was inspired by the wisdom of God. And he was inspired to write this in Proverbs 1, in verse 23, "Turn at my rebuke. Surely I will pour out my spirit on you, and I will make my words known to you." How? If you turn at my rebuke, if you repent and change. However, he goes on to say, "But because I have called you and you refused, I have stretched out my hand and no one regarded, because you disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke, I will also laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your terror comes. When your terror comes like a storm and your destruction comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me." Deathbed repentance, if you will. "But I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me." Why? Because they previously hated my knowledge, is what he says. And they did not choose the reverence of the eternal. They would have none of my counsel at that time, and they despised my rebuke. And therefore, they shall eat of the fruit of their own way, and be filled to the full with their own fancies. For the turning away of the simple will slay them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me, whoever listens to God, whoever listens to true and pure wisdom, they will dwell safely and will be secure without fear of evil. In other words, without being afraid of calamity. And so I ask us today to heed this warning from God. This is an enduring message to beware. Be aware that when we think that we know enough or that we have enough, beware lest we fall. Don't think that that crown is just sitting there for us. It's just waiting in heaven. All I have to do is go pick it up whenever my time comes. We are in a race. And in this race, not everyone gets the prize. People will be disqualified. Paul said it plainly. That is the dominating characteristic and prevailing problem of our age. It is apathy. Apathy toward the things of God, the things that are truly important. People think that they're rich, that they're spiritually well off, and I have everything that I need. I understand enough. That's okay. You know, it's okay if I'm not that passionate about the things of God. He understands. He's merciful. He'll let it slide. Take heed, lest we fall. Do not let the apathy of our age affect us, because we live in a time when most Christians are neither cold nor hot. And Christ said that he finds that disgusting. And this very well can be describing the indifference that is the main problem, not just with our era, but with this whole entire age that we live in. You know, many people know the basic truth. And many people in the Church of God have a basic understanding of the truth, but there isn't a single organization any longer that is zealous, that is on fire for God. There are dozens of splinter groups out there that nearly everyone has internet access to. If you don't like one group says, if it rubs you the wrong way, you can go to another. But Christ had a closing message for the Laodicean era that you and I live in. The last few sentences of his missive says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." There is a door of opportunity that is available to us right now if we are willing to hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And so you and I, we have an opportunity to become pioneers of a new age, an age in the world to come, a time when the world is going to be renewed, at times of refreshing, as the Apostle Peter said, a restoration of all things. It's going to be so exciting and so awesome when the nature of animals is going to be restored to the way it was when Adam and Eve were in the garden before they fell. What an adventure it is going to be. The projects, the peace, the prosperity, oh, it's going to be so awesome. But in order to get there, to be a part of that, you and I have to have the attitude of a God-fearing pilgrim or pioneer today. Notice what the explorer Sir Francis Drake wrote in 1577 while he was circumnavigating the globe in a single expedition. In a prayerful message, he wrote this: "Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we have dreamed too little, when we arrive safely because we have sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, when with the abundance of things we possess, we have lost our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we have ceased to dream of eternity, and in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of the new heaven to dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly to venture on wider seas where storms will show your mastery, where losing sight of land, we shall find the stars. We ask you to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push us into the future in strength, courage, hope, and love." Brethren, we live in an age where most people do not feel this way. And we don't want to hear, most people do not want to hear correction any longer. People want to be told that everything's okay. I'm okay, you're okay, we're all okay, it's all good. We're the good guys. This is an age of indifference that you and I live in. An age, or I should say an epidemic, of apathy. But we have the ability to resist it by making a sincere effort to strengthen our wisdom, or I should say to gain wisdom, and to strengthen our relationship with God. You see, the more we put ourselves into something, as Mr. Bradick had said in the past, the more we put ourselves into something, the more we are going to love that thing. And so the more we put ourselves into prayer, into Bible study, into practicing keeping the commandments of God in our decisions, in our activities, in our behavior, the more we are going to love it. The more we are going to love Him and the things of God. As Moses wrote, to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And as King David learned and wrote in a beautiful psalm, "Oh, how love I your law. It is my meditation throughout the day." In other words, I process all of my thoughts through the filter of your law. Always keeping God's ethics in mind when we make decisions, when we work, when we play, when we have conversations in our relationships. Think about it. Do it. Gain the kind of wisdom that comes through understanding and applying the things of God. Reject the apathy of our age, and great our reward will be in the world to come. If you'd open your hymnals and turn over to page